Workers who caused a $50,000 plus accident for their company, but didn't get fired. What happened? I was an irrigator for a large alpine tree farm. One boss sprayed field with a really expensive pesticide. Other boss didn't know and told me to water the trees. I washed off $60,000 worth of chemicals, got yelled yet, but other boss stepped in and took the blame. It was actually a great place to work. Blew out $300,000 worth of lights. A children's museum in Santa Ana, CA has a massive cube on its roof as a sort of landmark. It used to have the edges light up at night. I was told by a supervisor it needed to be shut off. Explained I didn't know how. She basically told me to figure it out, wasn't mean about it, but was clear. Long story short, it cost way too much to fix. So anyone from Orange County, CA now knows why the cube has been dark for the last 10 years. Edit. Autocorrect for those asking. The lights were installed around 2004, and they were not simple LED strips. They looked more like large tubes that stretched the entire edge, and they had a massive bank of computers controlling them. I have no idea how it all worked, but I was told a few months later that's how much it was going to cost to fix. It does sound expensive by today's standards. I worked in it for a certain multinational brewery for a time. We were carting some servers out of an old data center and into the new consolidated data center in the next building over. The servers fell off the cart and shattered on the ground into a puddle. $56,000 all dead. Me and the other tech cleaned it up, put the stuff in storage, then went to tell the boss. He pulled us into his office, closed the door, and sat us down. I was convinced we were both going to be fired. Instead, he started telling us his story about how he had been the youngest guy on the team when they first started rolling out the idea of computerized inventory management. That meant he had to fly out to each warehouse, oversee the offloading, and install of the mini computer from. At the first warehouse, he watched the truck back up to the loading docks, where pallets of canned and kegged beer sat, waiting to ship out. The mini computer, roughly 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 3 feet deep, was rolled off the truck and onto the dock. He inspected it, since it cost close to $250,000. Once he unwrapped it and saw no damage, he accepted and signed the shipping papers. Then they huddled up to decide how best to move the computer to its new location. Unfortunately, the computer was on wheels and be on a not level warehouse floor. While they were discussing, the computer started rolling. It plowed at a surprising speed into a stack of pallets of canned beer, splitting thousands of cans, fountaining beer all over the warehouse floor, crushing and soaking the new mini computer. The truck driver and the vendor tech straightened up, shuffled the signed acceptance papers and briskly walked out the warehouse door, letting them know to call when they were ready to order a new unit. We did not end up in trouble, since my boss figured if he hadn't gotten fired for exploding a computer and thousands of dollars in product, he could hardly fire us. Was installing a $80K circuit card in a machine. New card looked wrong. Couldn't tell why at first. Supervisor took this to mean I was an idiot. Installed the card. Card smoked. Turns out, it looked wrong because it was missing a few IC chips that had to be installed immediately before use. Not me, but this was the largest frick up multi-million-dollar I witnessed during my time in retail, and somehow nobody got fired. I worked in a warehouse selling bulk items to people. Hint, America's favorite hot dog. I was stocking a shelf when I heard a loud crash, followed by one of the most horrific screams I've ever heard in my life. We get over to the scene and find that a forklift driver had knocked a pallet full of batteries from the top of the steel about 3 stories up off the other side, crushing a girl I worked with. She broke her back in 5 places. Her hips were completely obliterated. Her femur broke. Basically, this lady was turned into a human pancake by a full pallet of batteries. By some miracle she survived and recovered almost completely, but it took her well over 2 years to recover. The forklift driver wasn't found to be at fault because the pallet should never have been placed where it was in the first place. There was a small return to vendor station on the other side where she worked. There shouldn't have been any pallets above them that would have placed them in the fall zone. She was paid out a $1M plus settlement, and for whatever reason still works at that warehouse to this day, part-time and far away from the steel. The driver was allowed to return to work after the investigation concluded, although he stepped down as a driver and eventually quit. I think he felt incredibly guilty because for a while they didn't think the girl was ever going to walk again. Moral of the story: don't frick around with forklifts and pallet placement. One little bump can really frick up someone's day. I was programming a CNC making prototype directional drilling tools. There were hundreds of thousands of lines of code generated. I made a decimal error editing a few of them, scrapped a 120k part. Luckily we made 2 of them in case of an error. Boss wasn't real happy, but in the end the customer was happy and ordered many more and ended up being a major customer of ours. It's a bad feeling though. You get a pit in your stomach upon realizing the mistake. I work in casinos, and we offer lines of credit to the customers. A customer sat down at a table and asked for $50,000 which the pit manager gave them. Had the pit manager check our system, she would have seen that his credit has been suspended. She starts freaking out. The patron already lost the money by the time she realized the line was suspended. The customer refused to pay since he never signed anything. The state fined us another $50,000 for failure to follow our procedures. Pit manager kept her job, even though it was the second time she made a mistake of this caliber. Edit: because people are questioning the taxes, and if this is a real loss, casinos are typically taxed differently than most businesses. Casinos typically pay their taxes daily or weekly depending on the state, and are taxed on what they won. So say the casino as a whole had $1,000 gambled there in a day, and they won $100 of this amount. The $100 would be taxed immediately for state tax. Then we would calculate our expenses and other line items, and pay our federal taxes at the end of year. I do irrigation for high-end estates. One year I forgot to unhook one battery-operated zone from a faucet. The owners returned home in the spring to 6 of water in their house, with a waterfall running down the grand staircase. Had to gut most of their $10 million house. Thank Jeebus for business insurance. Drove a dump truck into a 20 feet deep pit full of steel rebar. Jumped out at last second, which most likely saved my life. Wasn't old enough to drive. Was told to do so by older employee in position of responsibility. Did what I was told. Put it in first rather than reverse. Looked over shoulder. Took foot off gas. And went forwards rather than backwards. Rubber was destroyed. Dump truck was a write-off. As I was underage I was just given 2 weeks off and told to keep quiet. I guess they claimed on the insurance and said someone else was driving it. I work for a public hospital in Australia. No one ever gets fired unless you can prove gross incompetence or active attempt to harm a patient. Was working in sterile manufacturing, training a new pharmacist. I was pulled away to help cover another area at the same time. Trainee pharmacist made up a drug worth $60k AU using the wrong syringes. This drug had to be made up in special syringes because it leaches PVC. I got pulled up in front of the director and asked to explain why it happened. They weren't happy with not enough staff, need more time allocated for training, but it didn't go any further. I worked as a toxicologist for a short period of time. We had these giant machines that would screen urine for drugs, and each drug had an assay that would be stored in these giant plastic containers with nozzles on the end, so we could easily fill the machine's storage tanks. When the containers got low, about once a week, we would fill them with fresh assay that came in boxes, and it would take about 3 to 4 boxes to fill each container. My buddy and I were filling these containers, shooting the chute, when my buddy realized he put the wrong drug assay into the wrong container, like THC in that cocaine bin, or something like that. He immediately had to tell the supervisor of the cross-contamination. That bin had to be drained, cleaned with dewater, and refilled. We found out that he wasted close to $40,000 in product. Each box of assay was between $10,000-15,000 depending on the drug. Since he already had 2 to 3 boxes in that container, plus the one that he poured in, it was quite a costly frick up. He did not get fired. Side story involving the same guy. After the urine is test on the machines, we would have to take out the hundreds of vials of urine and dump them into these 50-gallon drums. The vials would always stick to the trays, so you would have to knock them off. We would wear full face masks, gloves, waterproof lab coats, etc. One day a droplet of urine flew back from his vials as he was knocking them off and miraculously landed directly on his lower lid. Do you know your body's immediate response to having something wet hit your lips? It is to stick your tongue out. So poor Joe sticks his tongue out and immediately tastes some random person's urine on his lip. He drops everything and immediately runs for the bathroom and gives his mouth a liquid soap bath. Meanwhile, I'm laughing so hard I'm crying as he runs out. Good times. A good friend of mine works for Bowers, a unionized commercial plumbing company. A few years ago, when he was a journeyman, he flooded the Kennedy Center in DC because he cut a pipe before shutting off the water. He fully expected to be fired, but nothing ever happened to him. When I asked what the Kennedy Center did in response, he just said nothing. I guess they have good insurance. He is a foreman now. It wasn't me, but a guy on my team when I worked as an engineer for one of the big 3 major American automotive companies. At the time, they were using a straight out of the 80s IBM based program for part cataloging, which had all but any checks and balances. Everything was coded with different 3-letter codes, which were not acronyms, just random letters denoting different things that could be searched in a different system for their meaning. If you were to only type 2 letters instead of 3, it would not allow you to save the changes to the part. However, if you were to type 3 letters that weren't the correct letters, it wouldn't stop you. A guy on my team fat fingered one of his commodities during production release, and when the vehicle launched in the plants a few days later, the commodity pulled 0 volumes for that variant of the vehicle. This means all the vehicles that had that specific sales code could not be built because the part was seen as non-existent by the plant system. Unfortunately for him, the code was a transmission code, of which there were only 3 for that entire vehicle. This means quite a few vehicles could not be built. It ended up shutting the plant down for over an hour. The rough estimate of profit loss that I heard was around $3 million. He wasn't fired, but had to do a presentation at our next town hall about fact-checking your work. Honestly, it was for the best in the sense that it expedited the team working on a new system that worked much better to replace the IBM system. I was 17, and I started working at one of my dad's businesses. When I joined, they were selling 5,000 all-leather jackets a month in Europe. I was very inexperienced, but I convinced my dad to let me handle it. He agreed but said he'll hire an advisor for me, so I don't make any colossal mistakes. On my second day, I authorized a previously cancelled order to be shipped, which was worth about $68,000. The jackets were ready, but due to being late on the delivery date, a new letter of credit needed to be opened which ensures guarantee of payment. I spoke to the customer in London, who said he will pay if I ship the items, but he won't open the LC because that's going through a lot of channels. I authorized the shipment, and just a few days later the company closed, and the guys who owned the company skipped town. My dad didn't say a word to me remarkably, but I learned my lesson anyway. A friend of mine was filling up an industrial tractor tire, and it exploded in his face. He hadn't been properly trained how to do it. He was in a coma for a few months, had facial reconstructive surgery, and tons of therapy afterwards. The company paid for all of his medical bills. I'm not sure how much it actually was, but I'd wager it was $50,000 plus. After he recovered, he was moved to an office job with the same company. Not happened to me, but I witnessed it. Used to work for manufacturing pharmaceutical drug testing products. We'd make the assays and control material designed to test for drugs. These assays are used fairly quickly, and a single order could be anywhere from 15k liters of the stuff. A colleague placed a pallet of 4 100L drums next to our plastic wrap station. We'd wrap everything in plastic wrap before shipping to make sure nothing falls over. He placed it on the 4 pickup side instead of the 4 wrapping queue, and another colleague picked it up with a forklift to move to the shipping area. The drums fell off the pallet, and we lost an estimated $250k USD and about a week's worth of progress. He wasn't fired. They worked him to the bone until he couldn't handle the load anymore, and he just stopped showing up for work one day. Edit. I asked a few of my former colleagues about the incident, and the damages far exceeded just the raw materials. The materials reached the entire factory floor, which had expensive instrumentation. All of those instruments had to be moved out, cleaned, moved back in, revalidated and configured by an OEM engineer that charges by the instrument. Each one of these instruments take about a half day to set up, and another day to test. The cleanup was big enough to catch the attention of, and they decided to audit us and set up a temporary office in one of the meetings rooms to stay on site for the better part of 2 months. The cleanup took a couple days for just the factory floors and a few more to get the instrumentation back up and running. That order was delayed 3 months and none of our customers were too happy with their orders being delayed either, with the whole of the factory being audited. I didn't fully realize the impact this frick up had, but I guess they did a hell of a lot more damage than just a couple $100,000. Not mine, but one I got to see play out. One of the first calls I got from a customer in my previous job selling power plant equipment was from a buyer who had purchased a little under $100K in products from my predecessor. He wanted to know why nothing he bought looked like the stuff he had been sent, thinking we got the order wrong. Turns out that sometime between the 70s, when the site was built, and 2012, the unit had been completely gutted and stuffed with another company's equipment, but for some unknown reason the customer failed to change their site drawings, and so when this guy started a couple months earlier, he had no way of knowing he was ordering the wrong stuff. I did what I could to help the guy out. We took back the common parts that we could sell to other customers, but he had to eat close to $70K in useless parts. His bosses weren't happy, but couldn't justify doing anything against him considering the circumstances. Was in Afghanistan, and one of the Kasajints, a really nice guy, always very helpful to everyone, was in charge of getting rid of some bad rockets that were set to be sent to EOD to be exploded. Was also in charge of the replacement brand new rockets that were supposed to go into inventory. He accidentally gave EOD the brand new rockets for disposal instead of the bad ones, and they were disposed of. Millions of dollars wasted by accident, and that's how our entire unit didn't get any awards for that deployment. Not me, but my mother had started a new job in advertising. New manager was too busy to show her how to properly operate the system, and the manual is completely useless to anyone who isn't already familiar with said system. She proceeds to make a mistake that renders the new ads of several companies essentially useless across an entire country. The ads can't be reshot. Each ad costs millions of dollars to produce, film, get approved, etc. Ad company had to reimburse the cost to each company, while also having to explain such a monumental frick up to national TV channels. Manager got called up to head office because, quite rightly, they were to blame. Neither got fired though. Edit. For all those asking about how exactly this is all possible, I'm afraid not too clear on the process exactly, but from what I understand, the system and business model is all cloud based. The ad is stored in and distributed from the cloud directly to the TV channels for them to broadcast. As I understand it, they have to embed some kind of code/key into the video so that it can be read and played by the channels and is secure. My mum fricked that part up, and the channels only realized minutes before the ads were set to air. No codes, no ads. Again, I'm not sure on the logistics, but I think basically it got stuck in the cloud. No way to send it out and play it, or bring it back and try again. And they also have a time frame to do this in, so that it gets approved by some kind of licensing board. Was working in investment banking at the time. M&A specifically had just closed a $4 billion deal, the fee for which was about $10 million for the bank. I was a new analyst, and this was my first time preparing an invoice. Turns out you need to include our legal fees in the invoice, which came out to the tune of $150K. Invoice went out without the fees. Client paid the $10 million for our advisory services. Didn't want to look like dimbuses after the fact, so we ate the $150K legal expenses. Managing director on the deal wasn't thrilled, but basically just said he should have paid closer attention to the invoice I prepared. Could have gone differently, but whatever. I ended up being directly responsible for netting the bank like $120 million in fees over the next 2 years, so at the end of the day nobody really cared. First week of my previous job, put in a buy of 230-year US Treasury bond future as a sell, so our master account showed a total that was 400 different from what it really was. Position was zeroed out to a total that was wrong by 400 futures. Came in the next morning and got my ass reamed for the 200k error due to the futures we had bought to flatten the position. Spent the entire day shooting my pants and miserable. Then my boss took me out for drinks after work and explained that the error was actually in our favor because the futures had gone up overnight and we owned 400 more than we were supposed to. Furniture warehouse. Drove a forklift into the steel I-beam holding up the warehouse roof. Lift never worked again, and I got stuck in the electronics cage pulling items for delivery and installing ice makers and doing door changes on refrigerators. Company was in dire straits anyway, so I didn't get fired and they closed their doors less than a year later. Not me, but a manager I worked directly with. Dude forgot to ship 2 trailers full of grocery product meat and produce to the store at the end of the day over the course of about a month. Product all went bad overnight, $50k each. Drove his industrial forklift through a shrink wrap machine sometime in that month too. Kept his job. Later got fired for shoving his manager against a wall and threatening him. A manager at my store broke a pipe that connected to the sprinklers with a forklift and it rained down on thousands of dollars worth of product and took about a dozen people about 2 to 3 hours to clean it up and sort out the ruined product. The guy didn't even get his forklift license suspended. It was not the first time he had an accident with it either.